budget is the increase to the youth department, and while I'm not necessarily opposed to it, I think more information is needed for the taxpayers to input on the same.
And Nick's here, and
So the way that the city does the budget, the way the city has to do the budget is to compare the budget that we're proposing for 2018 to the original budget from 2017. After the whole year is done and after we have completed the fiscal year, then we'll have, the budget may be a little different. Our budget was a lot different this year because in June or May, I think, we amended our budget to bring back Oakdale Summer Camp, which was originally cut from the budget. So we pulled in a bunch of money to be able to do that and to do some necessary repairs on the youth center. We're still doing some of those repairs. So what you see reflected in the budget here, the 41% increase, is not taking those factors into account. It's going from the original 2017 budget, which doesn't include there being a summer camp at Oakdale. It doesn't include those fixes to the youth center. We don't know what the total budget's going to be, but by the end of the year, when we look at the final budget for this year from what I expect and compare it to the 2018 budget, it'll be much more like a 10 to 15% increase in the budget than a 41% increase, which it is right now. So that's part of the discrepancy.
okay,
that you
but
see.
realistically, it looks like 10 to 15% is what will be needed. Why are you then asking for 42%?
Sorry, I probably didn't do a good job explaining it. Because trying to think of the right way to describe it, and I just got off my bike. I don't think the way to look at it is that we are asking for a 41% increase. I think that when you look at so at the end of this year, our budget will end up in the mid.
Your budget, but your actual.
Our actual budget will be, I don't want to give the exact number because it's going to be a little bit here or there, but I guess going down in history, if you look from years and years in the future and you look back, our end budget increase from 27 to 2018, actual budget to actual budget will be something like a 10 to 15% increase. The only reason that it's looking like a 41% increase is because of the adjusted budget that allows us to Oakdale Summer Camp. So I guess a simple answer is Oakdale continue to do improvements to the infrastructure, both at Oakdale Park and at the Hudson Youth Center, is why we had an adjusted budget that was higher this year.
Do you know the split on that? I mean, what's the additional expense for the summer program?
I think it was around $30,000 to $40,000 for the summer camp.
How many kids use that program?
We had a little bit over 120 kids this year. The most difficult thing about that summer camp is the staffing, getting the numbers right, because we have very specific numbers that come from the state as to how many youth sign up and then how many both lifeguards we have to have and just general staff. There's very specific ratios. And we are able to offset some of those costs, which we did this year by bringing in other workers, both from the AmeriCorps program and from the workforce program. And so we offset a lot of costs this year. So we'll probably end this budget a little less than what we thought we would with the adjusted budget. And some money will go back into I assume it goes into the general fund. But we still want to allot for the possibility of that next year because we don't know that we'll get those workforce workers. That number of workforce workers that the workforce program at Columbia Green offers every year shrinks. And depending on what their budget is, they can throw some people here and some people there. AmeriCorps shifts every year too. So we have to budget for being able to hire for those people just in case. If we get the workforce, that's great. If we get the AmeriCorps, that's great. But we don't know until July basically for those things. So it's a kind of a big unknown cost every year, which is difficult. But it's as we saw from the meetings where we were talking about funding Oakdale, the community, it seems like, feels very strongly that Oakdale is something that they want to see happen every year, and it's kind of an institution for a lot of families.
I agree. I'm right on the corner. It'd be nice to see more kids there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that
That's good.
okay?
That's cool. Thank you.
I'm confused. So we're not looking at a 41% increase?
If you compare it to the adjusted budget, no. If you compare it to the original budget, yes.
What's the adjusted budget?
So when a department like mine adjusts their budget mid-year, the budget is adjusted and it's a different. But so, okay, so let's give an example. These are rough numbers. These are not the actual numbers. But when I came into the department, our budget was roughly $250,000 for 2017. What's that?
262.
Okay, so I'll say the numbers and you can.
Sorry.
No, please do, so we get them right. And then, you remember you were in these meetings. I came before the Common Council. I asked to adjust the budget, to bring more funding in for Oakdale and for improvements.
Which was
That-
70,000.
70,000. There you go. So that brought us to roughly 337. So that's the adjusted budget. If we followed that exact budget exactly, perfectly, and at the end of the year, this year, our actual budget would be 337 for the end of the year. Right? As it went, that's how it'll go down in the expense reports from now on. The actual budget for 2017 was 337. So if you look at that compared to our $370,000 budget for 2018, the percentage increase will be somewhere around 11%. So that's, but the way that they have to do it, because we don't know what our budget's going to be at the end of the year, is to go by the original budget. So they compare to the original $250,000, not to what we expect it will be with the adjustments.
Heather, can you clarify?
Yeah, it's not because we don't know what the budgets are going to be at the end of the year. It's because when the first budget is established, like all government budgets, it has to be balanced. Revenues have to match expenses. That's what the budget is. If somebody comes in, whether it's Nick looking for additional programming for Oakdale or any of the other budget adjustments you've seen throughout the year, that's a one-time adjustment to the budget, but it's not balanced. It's only balanced because we take money out of fund balance to counterbalance it. So that's why when we start the budget at the beginning of the year, you have to start with the actuals, because the actuals are what you had a balanced budget to begin with. Any adjustments weren't addressed in the actual revenues that were identified to offset the expenses. So by putting in an adjustment and then an increase on top of that, that is actually a 40% increase versus the revenues we identified in the prior year to help cover all of the city expenses.
So this year's budget would be less than 70,000. That's how we got to 47%.
Yes.
Okay.
Don of Robinson Street in the 4th Ward. I noticed in the budget that the expenditures for the code enforcement department were essentially flat. And I'm wondering, in fact, any other issues where you can share where you wrestled with how to go, that were tough decisions would be interesting to know about. But focusing on that, it's my understanding that the law that passed that provided for the inspection of properties that were 3 or more units or commercial units were to be inspected every 2 years. And with respect to that, apparently only about a third of the people who should have registered did register. And second, there's been no inspections under that regime. Now, I don't know if that's true, but to the extent there's stuff that's being put on the code enforcement office, and there may be more if we go down this vacant building issue path, it surprises me the budget is flat unless you think there's procedures that can make it more efficient. Thank you.
Right? Would you like to address that?
I didn't really hear part of it. I heard something about inspections and fees.
Additional burden on your department that might result in higher expenses as a result of
I was referring to the program where.
Well, the
where in
computer
progress-
program that we put in place that was proposed in the budget was taken out. We were trying to get a grant for it, but there is no grants available. As of Thursday, I learned that it was eliminated from my proposal, and that was a big part of our increase in our budget in that department, because we're still in probably the 20th century. We're still doing things by paper, reporting agencies, end of the year reports and things like that. So that's where we're really hurting, and that was my biggest increase. Other than that, our fees and everything's functioning pretty well. I mean, our inspections are working right.
Well, I was referring to the program wherein every 2 years, units that are 3 or more on a parcel need to be inspected.
Commercial assembly use is every year.
But that this program of inspection every 2 years and their registration and all of that hasn't really been pursued.
Sure it has. They inspect every 3 years, and it's 3 family or more, residential only, and they have to register the building yearly. Now again, back when we started this program, roughly about 2 years ago, we knew there was going to be bumps and bruises with this. We're working very hard to get that program up and running. Unfortunately, the general public and the people that own these properties aren't as forthcoming as they're supposed to be. So that's something that we're addressing, on a daily basis. This year, we are hoping we have that solved, which means by the end of this year, everybody who's required to register their buildings will have to have them registered by January 1. If not, come January 30, they would be issued appearance tickets. So the revenue is going to offset.
So you don't think you need any more resources to do what you expect to be doing?
Not as far as personnel.
All right, very good.
Everything else that was proposed was eliminated, so
Thank you.
that's where we're at.
Other questions, comments? There being no further comments, I declare this public hearing closed.
I will now call this public hearing to order to receive comments on proposed local law, introductory number 4 of 2017, amending the city zoning law as it pertains to the definition of a dwelling unit, the off-street parking requirements for certain types of dwelling units, and the allowance of certain additional conditional uses. This public hearing has been duly advertised in the city's official newspaper on October 24th and 25th. Pursuant to the provisions of New York State, General Municipal Law, Section 239-1 and Section 239-N, the city has received the following correspondence. Copies are on the alderman's desks. Number 1, Columbia County Planning Board stating there would be no significant countywide or inter-community impacts associated with proposed local law, introductory number 4 of 2017. The correspondence shall be placed in the record of this hearing. I would now like to open the floor for comments. Please state your name and address for the record. Any comments?
Crystal Hines, 106 Glenwood Boulevard, I'm in the 5th Ward. I just have a couple questions and comments about the proposed changes to zoning. First, I'm struggling to find the connection between affordable housing and the dwelling units proposed in basements and accessory structures. The expense to renovate these projects, and I know from experience with clients, is significant, and frankly, I just don't think it will result in affordable housing. That's number 1. My second, and probably my biggest concern, is if these units are developed, who will track that they are not used for lodging, and who will enforce parking when it becomes an issue when they're no longer used for residential use, and they are sort of short-term Airbnb type rentals. I think there needs to be some mechanism
as to tracking what's going on in these units if we are going to exempt them from the parking requirements that the city has for other residential units. My second concern is the second proposal in the R1 district. I live in the R1 district, and frankly, I wouldn't be happy with any of these conditional uses being approved in my neighborhood. I am curious what the impetus is for this change and how many properties would be eligible to even apply for a special use permit pursuant to the change. I guess I'm questioning how many buildings in R1 have non-conforming uses or non-conforming uses that didn't subsequently become dwelling units. So I guess in the end too, I'm not in favor of either change.
Mike, would you like to comment on this, since it came out of our legal committee?
Sure. The orientation we took was that while addressing your concern about creating affordable housing is not so much that the units that were renovated and made available for residential use would themselves be rented out at a level that we would consider low-income housing, because of course the affordable is in the eyes of the renter, but that it would take some of the pressure off of the total rental units available in the city at whatever price they may be offered at. And the logic behind the parking issue is just that in many cases these are units that are, if they're especially if they're over a garage, that they would already have included the parking as part of the building that they're built over, that they're part of. The issue about the zoning for R1 and conditional use, of course the conditional use would be a matter of application to the planning board in each case afresh. So it's not as if there's a list of places that would automatically be included as of right. These are possibilities that exist because if the legislation is passed, will allow such proposals to even be considered, which they can't be by law right now. There's no way to do a change in use or a conditional use application for the sort of places that are envisioned. The part of the impetus for
places are envisioned?
Pardon?
What kind of places are envisioned?
Places that may have had a commercial use years ago, which are still configured for that use, restaurants, retail stores, and so forth, that have been out of that use for some time, and therefore have let the grandfathering period expire. And now, in a situation that would require significant expense to convert a ground floor space from a retail or restaurant or other commercial operation into a residential operation or use, what then is the grounds for the request is to put it back into its previous commercial use. That's the basis for it. So there are a number of those places in the second and fourth and lower fifth wards that we've had requests from people in those places that have said, you know, how can we make this even possible to do? Now, of course, the actual implementation of that is each time afresh something that would have to be a matter of application before the planning board. Does that make sense?
It does, and I guess I understand it to a degree, but it seems as though it should be relatively easy to prepare a list of what properties would actually be eligible for that. I think that's something that would be relevant to the discussion. It would also be...
You mean in terms of specific addresses?
Correct. I mean, I can't imagine it's that hard to figure out which properties...
That would therefore have to already exist and be identifiable and walk down the street and say, okay, this one is eligible.
By virtue of the proposed legislation, it seems as though you'd have to be able to know that anyway.
To be that specific.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. And your concern about that is the need to be specific because...
The potential impact on those of us that live in the R1 district. So without knowing how many potential properties are eligible, whether or not they have to appear before the planning board or not, it would be helpful in determining whether this is something that we want in our district, to know how many properties.
Because you think this would be approved by the planning board without you having a chance to speak up on it?
I didn't say that.
I mean, I'm just extrapolating from what you're talking about, that it would need to be identified ahead of time for the entire R1 zone to go out and essentially do a survey of properties that may or may not be eligible for this based on historical usage, which then would, and then the approval of which would depend on whether any such properties were within certain distance of your place or what?
Yeah, I think you've confused a little bit. I guess you're proposing to bring commercial back to R1.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
Those of us that live in R1, some of us purchased for the very reason that it's not commercial.
Right.
I live on one of the boulevards. It's pretty quiet out there. Not to worry about bars and restaurants and all of that. This upends
buildings
this.
in your neighborhood that would fit the bill that is described in that legislation?
But R1 is throughout the city.
Right.
And frankly, if I were somewhere else that maybe had the potential of that, I would be concerned. And I guess if you're proposing this special exception for R1 and those properties that had prior commercial uses that are non-conforming and that have not been turned into residential space, I want to know how many potential properties are impacted by this.
Understood.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Right.
Maybe I can add to it. My name's Craig Haig. I'm the City of Hudson Code Enforcement Officer, Code Enforcement Official, past Fire Chief of the City of Hudson, and a 31-year member of the Fire Department. To kind of add what Crystal's talking about, the R1 zoning district, to create commercial properties in that district, personally I think it's the wrong zoning section that you're addressing. The R1 zoning district comprises of Harry Howard Avenue, Joslyn Place, River Ledge Place, Michael's Court, Paddock Place, a little section of Glenwood Boulevard, and a little piece of Clinton Street. Lifelong resident here, and I know there's some folks in this room that have been too. I can think of one commercial property in all that entire zoning that's ever been commercial. It's always been a residential district. If I had to guess, this particular proposal should probably be for the R4 zoning district, which is down in the 2nd, 1st wards, and part of, I believe, the 3rd ward now.
Right.
So it's a totally different, wrong section of the zoning district that you're proposing. You're proposing section, or chapter 325, section 325-7. That's the R1 zoning district. I think you're looking to propose this in the R4 zoning district, which is 325-11 of the city zoning code.
Very good.
So first off there, to take commercial businesses and add them into a residential district that's never been is ridiculous.
Right.
Well, that's what the proposal is.
I stand corrected.
Well,
Let me look at that.
let me finish. So that's part one of that. So obviously that's misinformation that the general public's getting. That without this public hearing, I can honestly tell you, may have gotten passed. Which then we would have been back here probably in about 6 more months trying to correct that. Now I'm going to go on to about the residential changing of accessory buildings and alleyways and passageways of smaller accessibility to driveways and things of that nature, such as our alleys. City of Hudson has one alleyway that's always a controversy, is an alley or a street, and that's Petition Street. It's a street. We actually have residential properties there now. To take these garages, which we under state building code are accessory buildings, and convert them into residential structures. Right now we do that. And it goes in front of our zoning board because in all practicality, it doesn't meet the zoning requirements for lot coverage, setbacks, things of that nature, and the off-street parking. The reason that should probably stay in place because every case is different. If you just make it a blanket rule to change accessory buildings to living structures without no control, it's just an invitation for disaster. And I'll use the old mighty off-street parking requirements. We already know we're behind the 8 ball on that as it is. These buildings and these houses and these residential structures, and we'll use the most common on Warren Street in the back, all of them for the most practical purpose, has an accessory building. Well, that accessory building is for parking your car, storing your things that you generally would not store in your business or in your house, such as gas cans, lawnmowers, snow blowers, mechanical equipment, garbage containers, recyclable containers, things of that nature. So if the law was to change where people can convert these accessory buildings into living structures without any type of a review, which the way this is being proposed, that's the way it sounds to me, that every case is not being handled as an individual, it gives it a blanket opening for disaster. So then I'm going to use, again, the buildings where you walk out in your backyard and you go out to your garage and you want to take your garbage and your cans and put them out in the alley for garbage pickup. Well, if somebody's living in these buildings, how are they going to do that? Garbage is going to be picked up on the main streets in front of your buildings. That's step one. Off-street parking when there's snow emergencies, for example. People can't park on the main streets and they're parking in their garages. If they're no longer available to park in, where are they going to park? In the alleyways. Now we're going to have an issue with emergency services, your DPW services, things of that nature, because these alleys are not wide enough to have parking. We already have issues with them now. We have dumpsters in them, and it makes it very difficult to move fire equipment through these alleyways. So I would suggest or propose or make a comment that when you're considering this law, considering all these factors that we're talking about here, and make sure that we do it as a on-need basis. And to me, it's not an answer to the affordable housing. It's just not the answer. Not to mention the Historic Commission. Because these alleyways do carry a very important historic detail to the city. And in most cases, to make these places residential, we always run into the fact that we always have to look at them being destroyed because most of them don't have foundations. Usually they have dirt floors, and to make it a residential, they basically almost have to reconstruct the whole entire building, which is very difficult for the Historic Commission to try and get through, and a property owner to even, carry that burden. Right now, our commissions do very well with this stuff. I don't see the need to change that. If we make it a blanket policy where everybody can just do as they free and want to, Crystal's right when it comes, who's going to regulate it? Who's going to babysit it to make sure that they aren't doing things improperly? The parking issue is going to happen. I don't care what anybody says. You're going to end up parking in these alleys. Now, I had the fire department were going to be here, the 3 fire chiefs, the fire commissioner, and the fire safety officer. I also had a call out to the police chief. They got called away to an emergency. Because I wanted them to stress their opinions with this as well. Again, being a fire chief in this city for many years, I had to deal with garages burning in these alleyways where we couldn't get a fire truck through. A couple years back, right across the alleyway here behind Baba Louie's, we had one that burned. Coming from the east end of the alleyway, I couldn't get a fire truck through because it was blocked, with a car being parked there and a dumpster in the way. Now, if somebody's living in that garage, we as a city just put them people in liability. Something you should be thinking about. There's better answers to all of this versus living in alleyways. Thank you.
Was there somebody over here on this side that wanted to make a comment?
And I will as well after, but, John, you're not going to speak. All right, okay.
Steve?
Steve Dunn of the 4th Ward. First, with respect to Zone R1, if Mr. Hay is correct, we're talking about one parcel. So it would seem it'd be nice to know what that parcel is, and a policy decision could be made as to whether, with respect to that parcel, it should never ever be used again for commercial, only for residential, or whether it's fit to go to the planning board for certain specified alternative uses. And the council can make a policy decision. Either way, it's fine. And that removes that issue from the table. Mr. Hayes' comments seem to all revert back to the issue that if there are more residential units on the alleys wherein there was an exemption of one off-street parking spot from what would otherwise be the case, that it would exacerbate, in general, the parking situation in the city, and therefore cars would end up parking in the alleys, and fire hazards, and so forth. In reality, and this is a policy decision for the city to make, in reality, if all of those sheds on the alleys that some want to preserve as historic structures, that's fine, that's a policy decision. I don't agree with it. People can make their own decision. But to the extent those are converted into real garages that can park real cars with one residential unit above, which would typically be 400 or 500 square feet. Irrespective of how much it costs to build, you can only rent a unit of that many square feet for so much money. And the same for basements. So they should be relatively cheaper than other types of units. But in reality, by encouraging the building of a structure that has 2 parking spaces, rather than a storage shed with no parking spaces, plus 1 unit, you're actually ahead in off-street parking spots. You've gone from 0 spaces effectively to 2 spaces plus one additional unit. So you're actually gaining ground. So in reality, I don't think in general it would exacerbate the parking problem. And finally, regarding putting aside the Zone R1, it's relatively few places in the city. It's not a huge number. But there are situations where I think most fair-minded people, as to the ones I'm specifically aware of, would have no problem with a change of use. Could be an existing use. We had one example where somebody wanted to change it from a laundromat, which was no longer economic, to a chiropractor clinic. And the ZBA had to turn the other way and grant a use variance that it shouldn't have given. The Ore Bar. It wasn't legal to allow a bar there. So what the city did is pretend it's an art gallery, which doesn't require a use variance. So when you drive by the Ore Bar, just think of it as an art gallery. So we're talking about relatively few spots. Basil Nooks wants to put a takeout restaurant in something that used to be a bar 10 years ago, not serving any alcohol. There's no exemption from off-street parking for non-conditional uses, by the way. There's that corner space they're trying to rent retail in that 11-unit or room boarding house. They can't do that. And somebody wants to start a deli that used to be there on 3rd Street on the south side of town. They can't do that. The zoning board has no power to grant any such use variance. So these are reasonable uses. But if you believe in a city that's more densely populated, utilizes its land better, is more pedestrian friendly and has more mixed uses with services that are easy and accessible. And on the north side, we don't have any, so we have a couple of bodegas. Don't have any restaurants, nothing. It's a desert. Be nice to have some local services that are more affordable. Folks on my end of town in general can't afford Warren Street. That's what I have to say. Thanks for listening.
Victor Mandolia, 245 State Street. Thank you for holding this public hearing. And I wanted to speak in favor of the law and explain why I think it should be passed. As a realtor, I have seen the number of affordable units in the city, which is almost nothing at this point. If people want to rent an apartment in town, there is almost nothing available on a regular basis because of, some would say Airbnb has taken over some of those units, or so many of those units. But we do need to increase the ability of people to be able to stay here and live in the city that they love and they've grown up in or moved to because they love the place. So I think that there's a clear need for this type of housing. You know, a while back there was a big debate over the size of dwelling units, and I believe that at that time the number was already set too high. So we need to look at being able to have more micro-sized apartments that people can really afford, and they're not just called affordable housing, but are really affordable. I agree with Steve that in many cases that there will be an increase in off-street parking because of this type of work, because you are going to have usable garages that are not like barns. They're not, you know, a horse fit in them, but a modern car does not fit in them in many cases. And I know that when I had mine in the back of my house, I never parked in it, ever. So, and I certainly would if I had a garage door opener that opened up the garage in the back and I could fit into it. So I think that that's something to consider. I do think it would help the off-street parking situation. And I think we also have to look at density. You know, one of the things in this city is that we are not, we're a city, but we don't have the density that we could have, and that we already have the infrastructure to support. We used to have 15 or 16,000 people in the city, and certainly our infrastructure could handle it, but what we can handle is the taxes that we pay because we are so few. And I think that would be a big help to every taxpayer in the city to be able to have more people sharing the burden of taxes, and renters are sharing that burden. They share the burden because they have to pay the rents that will pay the taxes. And you know, people don't think of them as taxpayers, but they are de facto taxpayers, and I think we have to recognize that. So I'm in full support of the law as it's written with the corrections, but I say if you're going to turn it down, then allow it in the second ward, because most of the alleys in the second ward do not have. You know, Strawberry Alley certainly has a lot of the older structures, but mostly Columbia and State do not have those structures. And while I love the alleys, and I really do love the alleys, I think we have to look at smart solutions for our problems, and I think some things should be preserved, and others might have to go. These buildings were mostly built with without foundations and are in many cases in danger of collapse. The one next to me is trapezoidal shaped at this point. It's propped up by 2x4s and at an angle to hold it up. So most of these structures can't be saved, and some of not most, but a lot of the structures can't be saved because they are so dilapidated and so shot. They were not built right. You know, they were built by Uncle Joe on the Saturday. So I say consider that. I certainly think hands-off, you know, if the council feels that they need to have hands-off of certain alleys because of the historic nature, I say do that, but allow us to do it, you know, try and experiment in a smaller area if you're going to turn it down. Thank you.
Carol, did you have a comment?
Yes, I did. Carol O'Strank, 209 Allen Street. Craig Haig touched upon this a little bit, pointing out that none of these buildings can really be converted to living space without significant restructuring and usually demolition and building something that imitates it. And I do want to make a plea for the alleys, which are a very significant and picturesque part of our city. And there are requests before the historic preservation all the time to, they want to convert a building that was intended to be a garage or intended to be a stable into living space. So the consequence is the building is demolished and something that imitates, usually quite badly, what was there before is proposed to be constructed there and is constructed there. So the entire, the entire character of the alleys is going to be, completely gone if this law is passed, which encourages it. I know that we need more, more living space, but I don't think that having people live over garages and alleys is really, a feasible solution to this problem. We have so much, really, if you think about it, so many large vacant lots that have nothing on them, and we need to encourage people to build substantial apartment houses.
So what do we say to the people who are renting over a garage because that's what they can afford, and then they don't have a place to park? I mean, it sounds like, from the comments that are made, everybody is comfortable with where they live and how they get to park. But from my understanding, this law is to address those that have those issues that don't have a place to park, or they have a place to live that they can't afford without a place to park, and this is supposed to address that. So I don't understand.
This doesn't address anything that's.
I understand that.
No, it doesn't address, right, it doesn't, yeah, it doesn't really address that situation.
Yeah, I just have a follow-up comment. I mean, it seems to be that a lot of the people in favor of this, at least in terms of doing away for the parking for these smaller dwelling units, it seems to be that there's an assumption that since they're smaller, they'll be cheaper. Anecdotally, there on North Fifth Street is an 850 square foot 2-bedroom apartment listed for $1,800 a month. I have a friend that just took a 1-bedroom 600 square foot apartment on Warren Street for $1,200 a month. In my opinion, this isn't affordable, and I'm not sure how we equate smaller with affordable, because frankly, I just don't think that the two equal. We're talking apples and oranges here. We're not talking 1 and 1 is 2. Smaller just doesn't mean affordable. And I think that we need to take a more holistic approach than this, not just in terms of both changes that have been proposed tonight. Frankly, I think that the whole code could use an overhaul, and I think the piecemeal changes, frankly, just make things more complex and confusing and messier than they already are.
Bill?
So, I apologize for getting here late. I didn't know we were having this. But as far as talking about housing over the garages and also micro housing, I know I talked about this in the mayor, and quite a few other people in the city have talked about this. Something that myself personally am strongly in favor of, especially in the 2nd and 4th ward. And I would agree, it doesn't necessarily make the housing cheaper, but when you add more housing to the market, that drives the prices down. So some of those places may be more expensive, some of them may be more in line with a more affordable apartment. But one of the things that we're doing, and I don't know if this law is actually ready to be proposed yet, to be honest. I think you need to take into consideration some of the things that Craig brought up about fire space and access to the alleys, also parking. You're looking at square footage. As far as the housing, if you're going to make the housing, and I think we set the minimum, 500 square feet. If we're going to be looking at something like that, you have to make it mandatory that if they're going to build micro housing, that it has to be underneath parking. And also look at other ideas of whether it's going to be side parking. Can you construct new units in yards that have available space so you can do that? I think there should be a whole plan that's thought out around this. But I totally, absolutely agree that we should have micro housing off our alleys.
Steve?
Yes, a couple of things. One, I would note with respect to Carol Ostering's concerns that the Historic Preservation Commission still has the power to reject any project changing any of these historic horse sheds or whatever they are that aren't suitable for cars at the present. So that's a policy decision for the city to make and the Historic Preservation Committee to make about that. It really doesn't pertain to this zoning amendment, and it's the wrong venue for that. Finally, I would add, in fact, it's a plea, because I'm on the Zoning Board of Appeals, and I live with this and take a lot of pressure for it. The Zoning Board of Appeal, in general, is very reluctant, as is other precincts are in the city, to enforce the off-street parking requirements. And we grant variances that we, in my opinion, shouldn't grant. So, if you really want with these structures on alleys, and they're happening now a lot, right now, and they get their variances, they get the offset variances. We grant those typically because nobody's in conformance with those. We tend, often over my no vote, to waive an off-street parking requirement, 1 or 2 spaces. So if it's really important to you to preserve that for these new units that are created, you should affirm that. To give the Zoning Board of Appeals spine to actually enforce what's in the law books and that the city wants. The problem is, and I know Mitch, our attorney, Kashova, has said this and pleaded about it. The problem with a statute that you don't enforce over time and falls into disuse is then you kind of ignore it. So, and then somebody shows up and wants to follow what appears the law and you got a problem. So it's time for the city to state what its policy is going to be on that, to give guidance to the Zoning Board of Appeals and, for that matter, the Planning Board. Thank you.
Ellen? Yes, Ellen Thurston, Allen Street. I just wanted to say I once lived in an apartment over a garage. And the apartment was a pretty nice apartment, but it smelled like a garage. So I just want to reinforce everything Craig Haig said about the hazards of living in that kind of situation. I think he's absolutely right. And I didn't stay there very long.
I did leave one thing out, if I could have a moment. I wanted to just let you know that during, I was doing some work for the Raising Places grant that's happening, and met with Tina Sharp at Columbia Opportunities about housing issues. And one thing that she mentioned to me, and has now given me more information about, is that Hillsdale has passed an accessory residential law a while back. And after having had it be the law for quite a couple of years, they've now come back together and done a lot of work on how they could even improve it more. And it was a collaboration between the Columbia Opportunities, the Berkshire Taconic Foundation, and the Housing Action Council. So for the for the leaders who were working on this, if maybe there's some other ideas there that should be looked at to see how how it's worked and what didn't work over there.
Yeah, I just want to do a follow-up real quick. I just want everybody to understand that I'm not saying that any of this should be approved or not approved. I'm saying what you're proposing is to eliminate everything Mr. Dunn's talking about, such as right now, if people want to live in alleys and so forth and convert their buildings, there's a procedure for that. It's called planning and zoning. You shake your head all you want, but that's the facts. If you eliminate it with this law, there is no more control of that. That means people can do it as they wish. The only control would be through the building department. Secondly, again, with making commercial properties in the R1 zoning district, that is not down in the wards that were being talked about. Again, I'm not in a disagreement with that. That particular code, which is the R4 and the R3, Everything Mr. Dunn said is all in the R4 zoning district, and every one of them are a conditional permitted use, meaning it's subject to the approval of the planning board. You're trying to take these commercial properties and putting them in an R1 one-family residential zoning district. And all I'm saying is it's the totally wrong zoning district. What you're proposing in the second part of this proposal is for commercial identities, such as eating and drinking places, art galleries, museums, everything involved, is and should be approvable in most cases in the R4, such where Basil Nooks is, the commercial properties down there, that's the R4 zoning district. In this proposal, you're proposing it for the R1. So I don't know if anybody's understanding what I'm saying here. In other words, I'm not in a disagreement with these proposals, but you got the wrong zoning district.
Yes, thank you.
But I am definitely in a disagreement with taking away the proposed uses of living in residential structures in an alleyway without it going through a procedural board, such as the planning or zoning. Because again, every case is different. And that's, you know, you can beat this all you want, you can talk about it all you want, but that's a fact. Right now, we do propose residential structures in the alley to the ZBA, probably on a monthly basis. And just about, to my knowledge, in the 4.5, 5 years I've been in this position, every one of them but one has been approved. And that's reasoning. And I can honestly tell you, to my knowledge, I think only one, maybe two, on the northern end of the city. Every one of these structures had always been in the R3 and the R4, which is over behind Lawrence Street between Union and then over into the East Allen Street area. So again, we're not saying don't do it. All I'm saying is look at the facts and recommending you leave it the way it is, let it go through the cycle it does now. That way it gives the opportunity to either approve or not approve. Not just make it an open free-for-all for a blanket policy for people to do what they want to do. Because to me, it's just an open invitation for Airbnbs. That's a fact. And I could probably get hundreds of people lined in this building to tell you the same thing. Because I hear it on a daily basis. And that's all I'm going to say because I really get to go.
Doesn't it prohibit that? Doesn't it prohibit that? Sorry.
No, it doesn't. Because Airbnbs are single-family residential structures under the code. They're not even a commercial identity.
Steve?
Really quickly, I assume everybody understands this. There is no change to any of the procedures proposed by this law other than with respect to one off-street parking spot if it's not used as an Airbnb. Every other requirement is the same. You need a variance for setbacks and everything. Everybody is still going to have to get a variance before the Zoning Board of Appeals. Just like now, it's just that the Zoning Board of Appeals won't be under pressure to wink about waiving sometimes for an extra off-street parking spot. A lot of the proposals have the parking, and they by right can proceed. Thank you. Only that one change, parking. Nothing else, no other procedure change.
Any other comments?
Madam President, if I may, one, I would hear what what Craig just said. I would certainly hope that you would put in there that Airbnbs are allowed in this new structure. That would totally defeat the purpose of why we're all considering this. I also would hope that you would make that zoning change because he's right. The zones we are talking about are from like 5th Street down, not the boulevards, and I can name those couple of businesses for those who want to know up in the boulevards. If you're looking from 5th Street down, though, there were a great deal of businesses as I was growing up that were along State Street and Columbia Street that are no longer there, but the structures are still there. And some of these people are now buying these buildings with the idea of being able to put businesses back in there. So I would hope that we would change that language as well from the R1 to the R4.
Anything else? Okay, since there are no further comments, I'd like to close this public meeting. Thank you. And move on to the next meeting. Okay, moving on to meeting number 3. Meeting minutes, copies of draft minutes for October 17th have been provided to the council members and also have been posted on the city website. The treasurer's report, copy of the treasurer's report as of October 31st is located in the binder at City Hall for council review. Committee reports are on your desk. First resolution tonight is appointing commissioners of deeds. Can I have a motion, can I have an introduction and a second, please? Mike Abdus.
Good, Mike and Abdus.
Yes. Second resolution is authorizing the mayor to execute the CSEA union agreement. Can I have an introduction and a second, please? Tiffany, Priscilla. Next is the authorizing of a transfer of funds for the Transportation Enhancement Project and Safe Routes to School Project. May I have an introduction and a second, please? Tiffany and Alexis. On our desk remains the proposed local law, introductory number 4 of 2017, local law amending the city zoning law as it pertains to the definition of a dwelling unit, the off-street parking requirements for certain types of dwelling units, and the allowance of certain additional conditional uses. I think clearly from our previous meeting, this is going to need some reading.
Yes.
So it will remain. Proposed local law, introductory number 5 of 2017, amending the city zoning law as it pertains to the reimbursement of costs incurred by the Planning Board and Zoning Board of Appeals in connection with applications and appeals. That remains on our desk. A revised copy of the proposed local law, introductory number 6 of 2017, which is to preserve community character, local business ownership, and local wealth. May I have an introduction and a second to this local law? Rick, Alexis. And new tonight is proposed local law, introductory number 8 of 2017. It's deleting HCC section 70-4 in order to permit dogs to be present at Riverfront Park. May I have an introduction and a second, please? Tiffany Durega. And Rick. Do we have any other business tonight? Council? Public? That being said,
I just want to, being that it's being recorded, I just want to give a huge, big thank you to the high school kids who played the band music during the Veterans Parade. They did an awesome job. It was amazing.
any other business? Okay, before we close out tonight, please remember to sign these papers for me, and if we could get a motion and a second to adjourn. Rick, Priscilla, thank you.